Oh, for close totalitarian society, you ever heard of the American House
No.
exhibit? Oh yeah,
Oh,
so
in 1950, that one.
yeah, that they showed all
Late
a
50s.
modern American house
Oh,
and
yeah,
had
yeah,
like
yeah. Of
three or
course,
four
yeah.
million people come through it. So
Right,
for this
yeah, yeah,
closed society that absolutely nothing's allowed in or out,
yeah,
and then you set
yeah,
up an
yeah, yeah,
exhibit of
yeah, yeah, yeah,
American,
yeah. Was that
technology.
what wasn't that wasn't that exhibition staged at Verdansk? Wasn't it
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
early
it
days of
was, it
Verdansk?
was,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
was
it
there.
lasted for.
I was at Verdansk 3 4 weeks ago.
Oh, okay. You should have let me know. I would come said hi.
Oh, you're
Um,
in Moscow, are you?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, fine, right.
So next time, let me know.
Yeah, sure, do that, yeah, sure.
I'll be quite happy to come meet you. Yeah, the and it lasted for several months. They were talking about 3 or 4 million people went to see it. So
Right.
for a closed society, when you allow something, which in the 1950s, the U.S. was already, the number one
Yeah,
geopolitical opponent,
yeah,
and they
yeah.
allowed some of that.
Of course, there was a major kind of opening up of Soviet society after Stalin's death in 1953. Although a lot of this, I mean, there is this kind of idea that in the late Stalin period, like late 40s, early 50s, the Soviet Union was a very isolated kind of place. I don't think that's actually true. Actually, there was quite a lot of openness in that period as well.
Hmm.
But certainly what is true after Stalin's death, yeah, it becomes much more open in terms of its contacts with the outside world, particularly the West. And yeah, and this kitchen American house, this is the one where Nixon is this when Nixon visits it, doesn't it?
Hmm.
This is the same place. And they have like him and Khrushchev have the so-called the kitchen debate.
Yeah.
That's the place. So yeah, sure, yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's something else that nobody really talks about. Stalin tried to organize an ecumenical council in Moscow back about 1951. He had the patriarch of because he reinstated a patriarchy, and he had the patriarch go in and try to organize an ecumenical council of Orthodox churches in Moscow and turn the Soviet Union into the epicenter of Orthodoxy. He failed because the Greek churches, Athens, Constantinople, um, at that point, Antioch, Alexander, they were all under the CIA, and the CIA said, no
Mm.
way in hell you're going up to the Soviet Union for an ecumenical council. So that fell through. But yeah, he and Sergei Posad, which was the throne of the patriarchy, that there was only one church left in 22 June 1941 that was getting ready to be demolished. And from what people are saying, Stalin had a come to Jesus moment. He got scared. And because I mean, he had been in seminary, he was supposed to become a priest. And then after that, the Sergei Posad was rebuilt using the Komsomolцев. They were encouraged to go rebuild the churches.
Yeah.
So that's something that's not very often said. I'm not saying he
Yeah.
became an overly religious man, but maybe he did. I don't know what's in his mind.
And I'm just not. I don't buy this line that that Stalin found Jesus again. Ever.
Who knows?
I don't know.
Yeah, who
Well,
knows?
I think I know. The evidence says complete the contrary that he didn't. So it's pure speculation. But it's interesting you say about his effort to establish this ecumenical council of the
Mhm.
yeah, but that's an example of like outreach to the outside world, right?
Right.
There's and that's like you said, 1951. Yeah, there's another thing
Yeah.
that goes on.
In 1951 and 1952, it was right before his
Yeah,
death.
yeah, yeah. In
Uh,
1952, there's a big like world like economic conference
mhm.
that the Soviet stage in Moscow, right? Kind of
Yep.
business kind of thing. Yeah, where they're trying to develop business links for various Western companies, right?
Oh
There's
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of stuff that I know about going on in relation to the peace movement. Yeah, because
Hmm.
you get this massive peace movement develops internationally
Hmm.
from the late 1940s onwards, right? And that spawns various kind of like connections between peace activists and peace organizations all over the world, including, of course, the Soviet Union being at the very center. So there's a lot, this supposedly isolationist period of late Stalinism. Uh, that's the image people have it. There's actually a lot going on in terms
Yeah.
of the Soviet Union's connections with the outside world. But at the same time, it's still true to say that there is there's much more relaxation
Right.
and much more openness after Stalin dies, for sure.
There was even a case. Stalin awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the civilian version, to 17 priests in St. Petersburg who held their churches open because they kept morale up in Leningrad as it was under
Yeah,
siege.
right.
There was a lot
So,
of, I think a lot of the certain levels of repression, anyways, faded away very quickly when the war
yeah, yeah.
started.
Well, of course, during the Second World War, there's this big reconciliation
Yeah.
between, Stalin and the Orthodox Church, and not just
Oh,
the
the
not just
church bought a battalion of tanks.
religion in general, not wasn't just the Orthodox
Yeah.
Church. I mean, there was a different policy towards all other religions, Islam and so on. Yeah, obviously, it's part of the Great Patriotic War, the
Mhm.
mobilization of the Great Patriotic War. So there's a new kind of like relationship that develops, and that continues after the war and continues right away until the end of the Soviet regime. Because look, Khrushchev rediscovered his militant atheism from time to time, and there were some repressive measures under him. Yeah,
Yeah, the church even bought the Alexander Nevsky battalion. The church gathered money, bought
yeah,
a battalion of tanks,
sure.
of T-34s. Khrushchev, interestingly enough, when Khrushchev was removed by the Politburo, one of the points that they removed him for was excess pressure on the church. That he'd gone overboard.
Okay.
His militant atheism.
Yeah,
So
but that's an interesting point. I actually haven't, that hadn't occurred to me, because obviously you think about Khrushchev's removal, it's to do with like his relationships with other members of the leadership, which is very poised, very domineering.
oh yeah, yeah.
It's to do with the disruptions of some of his economic reforms, which didn't turn out very well. And some
No.
people argue that what some people saw as what's the word, a retreat in relation to the Cuban situation, the Cuban
Mhm.
Missile Crisis. But I've never heard that point about the yeah.
I mean, it wasn't the main
It
point
makes
by
it
and
makes
far.
it makes no, but it makes absolute sense that would
Yeah,
be part of the indictment of
yeah.
Khrushchev.
It was a pretty
And of
long
course,
indictment.
Khrushchev's
Hmm.
departure, of course, is very important from my point of view, or from Zhukov's point of
Hmm.
view, because it's post Khrushchev that Zhukov is rehabilitated as a great Soviet war hero.
Yeah, and he deserves it. I mean,
For sure.
starting with the fight with the Japanese. Uh,
Yeah.
nobody
Yeah.
seems to remember that either. Yeah, in
Right.
Mongolia.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about that fight in Mongolia, which while the Japanese didn't take giant casualties, I think they were like 50,000 KIA. That changed the entire course of the war because the Southern Party won, and they went south to expand the
Yeah.
empire instead of going to Siberia.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's well. I mean, I think in general, the problem with the northern strategy, Japanese strategy which is a kind of expansion in the Soviet direction, yeah, and also in China, was that the Chinese war hadn't gone very well for the
No.
Japanese. Yes, yeah. Been very and I think Halkid Gol, Zhukov's victory at Halkid Gol on the Mongolian border with Manchuria um, reinforced that message. Yeah,
Mhm.
the immense difficulties of expansion in the northern direction, as opposed to the southern strategy of seizing control of Southeast Asia and obviously attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and so on.
Yeah, Hugging Goals, by the way, the first time the T-34 came into actual combat action,
Right,
it scared the crap out of the Japanese. They had
right,
nothing
yeah,
they could stop
yeah.
them with. They had
Yeah.
light tanks.
Although okay,
Yeah.
it was a great victory, but the enemy wasn't necessarily
No, 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 they
top
were
class.
they were
Yeah,
suicidally brave, throw
yeah,
themselves underneath the tank to blow it up, but that
yeah.
only has a limited effect. It gets an entire tank battalion
Sure, yeah,
with
yeah,
infantry mounted. Yeah, and the Japanese tanks at that point were extremely light.
yeah.
They were
Sure, yeah,
basically tankettes, a little upgraded, like the
yeah.
French tankettes from World War One. They just slightly upgraded machine
Sure,
gun tanks. Mark Ones, and Mark Twos, German.
right.
So Panzer
Okay,
Kampfwagen.
right.
Yeah, so the Japanese never were good at building tanks back then.
Well,
The
they're pretty good at building cars nowadays,
yes, and
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 other
and
things,
very
and
good
many other
planes.
things. Everything else, yes.
The Zero was a very good plane,
Right.
uh, but the tanks were just well. What was interesting was the German super submarines, the transport submarines. when Americans started running into German 88s in on Japanese islands,
Right.
lighting them up. They were disassembling these and shipping them in large enough numbers
Right.
to the
Okay.
Japanese.
Right. Okay. And very good. The anti-aircraft gun you're talking about,
Yeah,
yes?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was original anti-aircraft gun, but man,
Yeah,
that was the
sure. Yeah.
best cannon in the
Yeah.
entire
Yeah.
war.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. 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 Of course. Yeah.
So
An anti-tank weapon as well. Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
anti-tank, it became a tank gun. They
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
remounted. The Germans remounted on the and mounted on their Panzers or
Right.
Panthers.
Yeah. Sure.
The Panther had the 88.
You see, I do know something about,
Yeah.
the technology. It's coming back into my mind. Yes.
Yeah, the problem when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they were bad enough trying to fight the first models of T-34s. When the KV-1s came out, that was it. The only thing that could take on a KV-1 was an 88, and by the time you mounted the 88, there's nothing left of that 88.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was in the anti-aircraft mode. You
Yeah.
have to
Sure.
bring it up, tow it up, get them out, and meanwhile the T-30 the KV-1 is looking at it and opening fire on it,
Right.
so
Yeah.
or
Sure.
just driving right over it. So those were monster tanks. I mean, just gigantic monster tanks. Have you ever read anything about German tank construction in World War One?
No. No, I haven't. Sorry.
There's a reason for that. It almost didn't exist. Achtung
World War One,
Panzer.
you said, yes. Yeah.
Guderian's Achtung Panzer is very worth reading, as he goes over these battles on
Only in the
and
First World War.
First World War. The Germans, I'm gonna tell you exactly how many tanks the Germans built. Now, these were those giant land tanks that were like 11-man crew that looked like a ship. They built 47 tanks.
Right.
And they captured another 45 Mark IIs and then French tanks that they repurposed and resent. So they had a whole tank force of under 100 tanks through the whole war. Right. And the high command came out with, our soldiers are brave, they'll figure it out. And the Western Allies built between the different British Mark I's, Mark IIs, and then the tankettes from all different sizes. They built like 5,000 tanks.
Right.
Against 100.
Yeah, I didn't realize that they produced that many.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
War.
some of these, a large number of them were tankettes where you had a two-man crew, basically a machine gunner and a driver. And the machine gunner was standing. There wasn't even a place for him to sit down.
Sure, yeah.
Those are French tankettes, but against rifles, that are pretty damn effective. So,
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, it's a book worth reading. It's a very interesting book, just as a history book of World War One, the final battles.
Yeah. I have to say I haven't read it. Obviously, I know about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good work. It definitely should be in everybody's library if you're studying military history.
Right.
Because that's what it was meant, teach the Germans that, hey, it didn't work the first time. We don't need to do this the second time the same way.
Right, yeah.
They take a different path. So, well, what do you think? I mean, lately, there's just been big drive to try to drive Stalin out of the history, period. It's the Soviet people. It was, as if the whole country just organized itself without any leadership. And then trying to emphasize that, yeah, Stalin was in depression for the first 2 months, things like that.
I hadn't particularly. You're talking about in Russia, are you?
No, in the West. And Russia's is going quite the opposite direction these days.
I hadn't particularly noticed that myself. It's quite a difficult thing to do. No, I mean, I would say that Stalin, remains a central figure. But specifically in relation to the Second World War. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you talk about in your introduction, Stalin's Wars and the controversial book and stuff like that. Well, I think that was true at the time, but actually, it's not so true these days because I think the book was published 20 odd years ago. Yeah, 2006. Yeah, 20 years ago. But now it's kind of like it's central, kind of like narrative and argument. That Stalin was actually quite an effective war leader, and we can actually demonstrate this through the actual story of the war from his perspective, and the function of the Soviet High Command and all the battles and so on. that kind of argument of mine, okay, it wasn't mine, only me who put that argument, other,
Mm.
is quite generally accepted. Yeah, okay, it's grudging acceptance about a lot of people, but the idea that, well, in a very real sense, Stalin was a great war leader
Mm.
is, I think, I'd almost say that's the consensus now. Now, of course, people also say, he was also a great monster. Some people say, he was he was a dictator, and there would be. He might have been effective during the war, but was ineffective in other things. So there's certainly, obviously, there's an argument about Stalin, but certainly in terms of his reputation as a war leader, I would say it's still riding pretty high. And okay, some people might want to write him out of the story, but it's completely impossible to do given what the Second World War was and what actually happened.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read into any archival documents on this, but from what I've read and what at least in some of the scholarly works, Stalin in 1948, as NATO is being formed, Stalin asked to join NATO to set up a European uh, peace structure. Which, by the way, interesting enough, Nicholas II was the one that first started pushing for a League of Nations and a comprehensive European
Yeah,
peace structure. So,
absolutely.
from the 1880s. And that didn't quite work out,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
a very interesting point. Yeah. Well, actually, you can take it back further now. You can go back to Alexander the First. Yeah, you can go further back.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. In fact, I'm kind of like writing an article about that very topic. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But in terms of what you said about the NATO business, yeah. No, okay. No. Well, of course, what happened was that it wasn't Stalin. It was actually Molotov. Molotov
Hmm.
in 1954 made a proposal on behalf of the Soviet government that if NATO was a defensive organization like it claimed, then the Soviet Union would be interested in becoming a member of that organization. Okay, and the proposal is like pitched in the form of at that time. The Soviet Union, Molotov had a campaign for European collective security, right? For a
Right.
common European collective security space, which, by the way, is still the position of the Russian government. So it was part of that. So the idea was, Soviet Union can join NATO. We can have this common collective security organization, which the United States could be a part of, right? And then we'd have a common European, a new kind of structure of security. So that's it. That's in 1954. Now, but there were precedents for that. Is that even when Stalin was still alive, the Soviets were saying, well, maybe we should join NATO. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and including, I think there is one statement by Stalin to that effect. But it's not until 54, after Stalin's death, that the Soviets actually make a formal proposal that the Soviet Union should join NATO. And of course, if we jump forward to post-Soviet times, it's very definitely the case that Russia, post-Soviet Russia, was very interested in the possibility of becoming a member of NATO, but only on the basis of it being a kind of like an equal and full partnership, between Russia and the West. Right? They weren't
Mm.
interested in becoming a subordinate, within the NATO structures. And of course, the whole project of a common European collective security system. That project continues to be pursued by Russia in post-Soviet times. Now, currently, I mean, Putin has started talking less about European security and more about Eurasian security. So apparently, Putin's thinking that what you need is Eurasian,
Hmm.
pan-Eurasian, pan-European Asian security structures, not just European ones. But what that means in practice, in detail, is not clear.
Yeah, it's sad that, for even if you don't take Alexander the First and post Napoleon, and just even if you just start with Alexander Nicholas II, that's already 140 years
Yeah,
trying to
sure.
establish a peace structure for Europe.
Yeah,
If we could have avoided World War I, my God, that
yeah,
history
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not even going to talk World War II, but just World War One. There's just been an entirely radical, different development of humanity.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, of course, is the question: well, why did these like Russian and Soviet and post-Soviet Russian attempts at common European security fail? How do you explain the failure? Yeah. Okay. Long story, but I think you explain the failure because consistently Russia is seen as being a threat. Yeah, being an adversary or a potential adversary, rather than being an ally and a friend. Yeah, and that's, in a sense, that's why we're in the situation we're in today, because of this perception. That Russia in the West, that Russia is a dangerous adversary, and you can't ally with it, you can't have friendship with it, you can't be part of the same. What you need to do, you need some way find means of containing Russia, and preferably not just containing Russian power, but actually undermining Russian power and weakening Russia as a great player. And that kind of like the current story about it's actually, you can trace back, I don't know, 200 years.
Oh yeah. Well, it's kind of like if you look at German politics, the party that's the evil psychopaths are the ones that are going, hey, why don't we have peace and have a normal economic policy and not militarize? Oh no, you can't have talks with the alternative future for Deutschland. They're crazies. They're crazies. They're Nazis because they want to have peace and they just live a normal economic life. It's the same concept. Oh, the Russians want peace again. Damn it.
Sure.
Well, let's start a war. Why? I looked it up real quick. I was wrong. It wasn't 1951. It was 1948. And they did have a pan-Orthodox conference, but it wasn't the Ecumenical Council because they couldn't get the Greeks in. The Greeks were already fully under the CIA, so they refused the different Greek church Orthodox churches. They had the Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Georgian Patriarchy. Well, obviously, Georgian Patriarchy is part of Russia.
Thanks for that. Another thing I've learned from you today. I'll check that out. Yeah.
So it was an attempt. He was trying to make the Soviet Union a center of orthodoxy. Didn't work out. It's like, thanks, good try, but
right. Yeah.
And history rolls on. It was because I always thought it was 48 when Stalin. So it's interesting that it was Molotov in 53.
54.
54.
Yeah, 54. Yeah, Molotov was the one who, this post-Stalin, develops the idea of European collective security, a pan-European collective security system. Yeah.
And Yeltsin also asked, and I was talking with Colonel Wilkerson, who was chief of staff for Colin Powell, both in the military and when Powell became Secretary of State. And he said George Senior had the George Senior White House. They were literally looking at it as a realistic thing and bringing up plans. But one, George Bush Senior lost the re-election, and two, Clinton with his little problem with stains on dresses and his various liaisons, he needed to look tough. So he said, that's why they deep sixed it. They needed to look tough against somebody to get their credibility back, and who better look tough against than the Russians at the moment. So they deep sixed that whole initiative from Yeltsin.
But I think they deep sixed it, but because they felt they could. They had the luxury to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because Russia in the 1990s was very weak. So they could treat it, in that way. Yeah. So
I think George Bush Senior had a better understanding. He was former head of the CIA. He had a better understanding of what was going on. He was, by the way, the last one that could control the Israelis too. He quite literally cut them off from supplies.
You say that about George Senior to Bush and all that, but he was the one who originated this kind of narrative of America's victory.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
I'm not excusing him. I'm not a big fan of it.
Which is the foundation stone of all the kind of like the very negative poor strategy that the Americans pursued towards Russia after the Soviet. I think also the Americans see other states in Europe as being more important than Russia. I mean in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc. That's their priority, is to develop relationships with them, and obviously ultimately to expand NATO into Central. So Russia always takes second place, all along until, of course, Putin comes along and shakes things up a bit, and this is a more equal relationship begins to develop between Russia and NATO and Russia and the United States.
Well, toward the end of '99, I got transferred into 18th Airborne Corps headquarters, G3. I was a captain, and lo and behold, during that time, except for when we were planning the invasion of Iraq and taking Baghdad, all scenarios, everything was being worked out against Russia, which in the end is why I finally left, because I didn't want to participate in that. And that, it up to '99, it was, I think, pretty lackadaisical, because they're like, it's got to die in its own anyways. Yeltsin's making sure it'll collapse. And then after '99, it's like, something went wrong. It's things suddenly start turning around. Chechnya 2's over, and then the alarm bells start going off at that point. So it's not going to plan. But yeah, I don't know where George Bush Sr. would have gone with it if he had gotten reelected. But we know which way Clinton went. There was definitely expansion of NATO, and on and on and on. Unfortunately, and the rest is history, and here we are.
But even so, even in the face of that treatment, and NATO expansions and develops, there's still, not just Yeltsin, but Putin was interested in developing a collaborative relationship, including the possibility of NATO membership. Now, I think NATO membership is definitely off the agenda now, but the idea of a collaborative relationship between Russia and the United States, it seems to me, is still central. Remains central to Putin's thinking about world politics. Now, how long that can persist, it obviously depends on how various things work out. But it's actually amazing the persistence with which Russia has pursued cooperation, collaboration with the United States. Which I think, by the way, I think it's a good thing. I'm not one of those people who criticize the Russians or Putin for doing that. What I lament is the fact that they failed. Yes. They failed in the face of Western negativity.
Absolutely. I mean, most Americans don't know that the Russian Empire helped them get their independence. And B, the Russian Empire was on the side of the Union during the Civil War, which may have been a mistake. I think that was more emotional at that point. Alexander II was still a little bit sore about Crimean War 10 years earlier.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
I think if you looked further on, it would have gone, maybe we should side with the South after all. But history is. He was just where the British and the French will be on the other side, which is not a good way to make policy, but it is what it is, unfortunately. And you would think, I mean, like it or not, for the Europeans, Russia's 42% of Europe. By PPP, Russia's the biggest economy of Europe. It's got the biggest military force of Europe. It's got most of the resources of Europe. It's got most of the farmland of Europe. It's got the biggest population of any European country. You'd think you'd want normal relationships.
Absolutely. It makes complete rational sense for that to be the case. Yes.
It's and what nobody talks about, Russia has, I think, the fourth or fifth largest economic manufacturing base in the world.
Right.
So it's a huge manufacturing house, too. Sure, it's not just oil and gas.
Yeah. I mean, I remain hopeful, optimistic that possibility might realize itself. Obviously, at the moment, things look very negative as far as Russia's relationships with Europe is concerned. But I don't know, things can turn around, very, very quickly. Political situation in Europe could turn around very, very quickly. If Marine Le Pen wins the French presidency in a couple of years' time, that could radically alter the geopolitics between Russia and Europe, who knows? And so I'm kind of like, I'm hoping that Russia persists in its pursuit of improved relations with Europe into the future.
What about Farage? Yeah, when Brexit happened, there was a lot of hope that it'd finally be able to develop normal trade relations and everything with the UK, and they were developing. And then everything went went very bad. Um, any chance of a Farage change in British politics, or is it just a
I,
home
I,
for disenfranchised Tories and same politics
no,
as before?
no, I think a Farage um, premiership, prime ministership, yeah, it would shake up British politics. Very hard to predict in what kind of direction, but certainly Farage himself, and I think the reform movement in general doesn't kind of like share the hostility towards Russia and Putin. That kind of consensus among the establishment parties. So yeah, and also the Green Party in the UK is also its strength is increasing. Yeah, and okay, they've had a very like pro-Ukrainian line in the current but the impression I have is that they're open to at least negotiation, at least talking to Russia, to Putin about things of mutual benefit. Yes, and of course the new German situation, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. Yeah, I mean, who knows what's gonna happen, and then other countries as well. So at the moment, it's a very like pessimistic picture in terms of the current state of Russia's relationships with Europe, but that's to do it's Russia's relationships with the present like European political elite, those who have the power at the present time. I mean, but all like the hostility there is between Russia and Europe at the present time, I don't see that as being very deep rooted in terms of popular sentiment. I
Hmm.
don't see any real evidence that there's a deep rooted anti hostility towards Russia among European people. Certainly, there's some, which is not surprising given the kind of like the propaganda, anti-Russia propaganda that's been intensively spread in the West, particularly in the last 5 years, 5 years. But there's no like inherent deep reasons why the political situation in Europe can't turn around quite quickly, and that can't have beneficial effects as far as Europe's relationships with Russia are concerned. Yeah, yeah, but the most but what's what's crucial in that regard is obviously that the war in Ukraine has to come to an end, right? That nothing's going to happen until the war ends, and also the war has to end on a kind some kind of a negotiated basis. There has to be a stable, some kind of settlement that stabilizes the situation. That's the context in which you could get quite a radical and quite a quick reconstruction of relations between Russia and Europe. If that doesn't happen, the war drags on in some form, then of course we could be in the situation we're in now for many more years to come.
Yeah, yeah. Well, until as long as you have the more radical elements in the European Union that are in power, the Zelensky types that are making money off of this war to the very end. Unfortunately, I don't see too many things happening without an actual major move on the battlefield. Um,
Yeah,
at least not
well,
from a.
obviously, yeah, sure, but yeah, it depends what happens on the battlefield. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but I don't know. I mean, it depends on your view. I mean, my view is that is yeah, okay, yeah, it depends what happens on the battlefield. Yeah, sure, that's right. But okay, but the thing about these like radical elements, I mean, I think the key to one of the most important things to understand the current situation is that these radical elements, as you put it, they want to see an escalation of
oh
the
yes,
war in
yes.
Ukraine, right? And one of the things that obviously Putin and his government they're resisting that provocation, right? And I mean, my concern is that the provocation might become so intense that there might have to be some kind of
Yeah.
response to it. But having
Well, it's
said
their
that,
aim. That's absolutely their aim.
yeah,
Is to up the ante to a point where there's going to be no choice but a response.
yeah, I think that's right. Except I don't actually have the antes up. They don't really have that much to up. I mean, obviously at the moment there's a lot of focused on the long range drone warfare,
Hmm.
but like all these like developments in the Ukraine war of the last 4 or 5 years, where there's an escalation on the Ukrainian side and on the side of their Western backers, they all tend to be signs of desperation and of weakness. Yeah. So
Hmm.
the current campaign, drone warfare campaign, is they have this idea that they can demoralize Russia, or they can what's the word wear it out, yes, and create a position where they can force it to come to terms that suit them. As far as I can see, that's a complete and utter fantasy.
Oh, it is.
There is no basis for it whatsoever. So I don't think they have the ante to raise to actually to a sufficient level that the Russian side is going to have to escalate. The Russian Putin's strategy, the Russian side seems to be doing what they're doing is advancing on the ground, to secure their objectives in relation to the Donbass, whilst at the same time conducting their own like long range strikes against Ukraine. Strikes, of course, and drone warfare, missile warfare, which are much more effective, much more extensive, much more impactful than anything the Ukrainians are doing to Russia at the present time.
Well, I've got a time constraint. I've got a. We've been. I know I've had you on for quite a while, but on a positive note, the whole concept of trying to wear Russians out. One only needs to look at Gorlovka as a prime example. Gorlovka, which is on the front lines, Gorlovka, which has not had water since 2014, 2015, because the Ukrainians
Right.
keep hitting the water mains and the pumps with artillery or drones or missiles. Gorlovka's pre-war population was 380,000 people.
Right.
Gorlovka's present population is 320,000 people. They
Right.
refuse to leave. It's their land. They're Russians. And, my grandparents were born here, my great grandparents, and the hell I'm going to leave. And
Sure.
so, you have people that have spent quite literally over a decade, 12 years under fire, and they won't leave. I've been to Gorlovka more than a few times. You see burned out apartments where Ukrainians will fly in FPV drones up to an apartment building, look in the windows to see if they see people in there, and then ram that drone in there to blow up the apartment. You see burned out apartments like this. I've driven up and down the highway of death, which is the basically the edge of the city, with drones taking out cars and artillery strikes, and the people there, and this is just a typical Russian mentality. This is our land. We're not going. That's it.
Mhm.
You can kill me, but I'm not leaving. You can kill me, but you can't defeat me. That's the Russian mentality.
Yeah.
I may die, but I'm not going to be defeated. And defeat is stepping back. So
So it was the same spirit that defeated Nazi Germany during the
exactly.
Great Patriotic War.
I mean, we've been invaded. People forget the first big invasion, pan-European invasion of Russia was 1012 AD.
Right.
By Yaroslav Hrabry, the Crown Prince of Krakow, and his Holy Roman Empire allies, German states. They grabbed Kiev. They pushed Vladimir Krasnosonce out. They couldn't hold it though, and they got pushed back out. But after that, it was game on. Pretty much. There's very few countries in Europe that haven't had a shot at us at least once, or at least a
Right.
coalition.
Well,
Like the
well,
Portuguese.
Russia has always survived, and I'm sure it will do so in the future. I only hope that we all survive with Russia.
Yes. I'm not a big fan of throwing nuclear weapons around. If we can avoid that, that's kind of a
Yeah, that would be a
hard to
plus.
fix issue right there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it would very, very hard to fix.
Yeah, you can rebuild after a conventional bomb. It's pretty damn hard to rebuild after a 50 megaton or 100 megaton or not megaton, kiloton or maybe a one
Yeah,
megaton hole in the ground. So
yeah,
I prefer not to
absolutely.
go down that road.
Sure, me too.
So yeah, I've got kids. I want to see grandkids and great grandkids and so on,
Sure.
and not with two heads and three arms.
Right.
So
Okay.
thank
Right.
you,
So
thank you very much
on that
for
note, yes,
joining.
optimistic note.
Yeah, on an optimistic note, let's avoid all that.
Well,
Uh,
thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. And next time you're in Moscow, drop
I
me a
will.
line
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
come.
I'll definitely
I'll
drop you a
definitely
line. Yeah,
come
yeah. I'll be
meet
back
you.
there in the next few
Mhm.
months or so. For
Oh,
sure.
excellent, excellent.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Thanks.
drop me a line. I'll happily meet you.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Yep.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.